Welcome to the Adapting Places podcast. I'm going to continue this series on decision making under uncertainty as I'm making my way through transcribing a lot of the interviews that have come through my way as part of my PhD. So I'm hoping that as I talk through these things, some of the insights from data kind of come out, and I'm no longer just stuck talking about somebody else's literature, which is quite exciting. And given that I spent 4 years in this PhD process, so I covered off some basic assumptions about uncertainty as the default in the previous episode, which I experimented with adding music to it, which I was using through Anchor, which is Spotify's podcast recording app. And turns out if you use music from Spotify, the podcast is only available on Spotify. So looks like the audience has shrunk. Or I'm being shadow banned. That's a new thing. Yeah, the numbers have gone from 12 listeners to 1. So to that one person that's hanging on, stay with it. Right. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about decision making under uncertainty, and I'm going to try not to mix too much of how we can make decisions about what's good knowledge, kind of how can we make science about decision making, and then on the other hand the actual decision making by people. But it's inevitable for me to confuse the two. I've just noticed, I've tried to split the first conversation away, like just making some assumptions about what reality is like, but discussing how we can know reality, so questions of the big word epistemology, I find it really difficult to then split away from the ways that I'm finding people think. So it's what some people call a naturalist tendency, which makes me think that if I keep seeing people think a certain way, well, it's likely that kind of thinking is also in science, if it's human science, even though we follow processes and procedures that try to protect us from the downfalls, from the biases that pop up when we make decisions under uncertainty. And I think it's very important here to mention that I've heavily read around the works of Kahneman and Tversky, who are what have become popular through behavioral economics in more popular books. After them, Taylor and Sunstein are people that write about how this decision making actually can be used for policy making. So it's important to mention that. But also, I've got this other side of the literature which doesn't focus as much on the biases that people have when they make decisions under uncertainty, but on how the detail of how they actually make decisions from the first person perspective and their justifications for that. So it does seem that this kind of a decision inevitably is one about the methods of studying the world and people in the world. Because if you take the what's called the Heuristics and Biases literature, for short, the Kahneman Tversky, the focus on people's kind of illogical shortcomings. Well, very often that tends to be done in a more behavioral, observational, from the outside perspective way. Whereas on the other hand, if you want to actually have a glimpse into, well, okay, tell me how you actually made that decision, why, those reasons, that tends to be more psychological and from the first person perspective, phenomenological, as people say, kind of a, and that doesn't seem to have that much of a great status in quote unquote hard science, but I'd argue it's the only way you can actually get to see through someone else's eyes for a bit. I mean, it's difficult. People try to argue that neuroscience gives us evidence for that, and neuroscience can be a tool used together with first-person accounts, but it doesn't really describe experiences of decisions that are made from the first person. To bring it down to the topic of my interest, which is, how people choose where to live, and before I actually talk about my PhD, I've been finding it very interesting to see how so many celebrities are openly talking about changing where they're going to live, after the coronavirus pandemic, big life decisions. And I already did have that hunch that, moving where you live should be considered a much bigger decision than it tends to be. So a lot of times it tends to be considered as well, at least in the literature, I think people actually do ponder those questions quite a bit. But in the literature, it's, get a job where the jobs are, and then in practice, it's, jobs, get the jobs, and then people would come. So it's been interesting, like the exodus from California to Texas. And again, it will be an exaggeration to say Texas, because I think it's, people going to the hub of creativity and openness that Austin is. I mean, I say these things just because I've heard them, to be fair. I've actually not researched Austin. I know very little, so I don't want to expose my own biases about what I think about these places, but it's interesting to see how there's this alignment of choosing where to live and your personal fit with the place. In the podcasting world, Joe Rogan, one of the biggest podcasts, if not the biggest, big Spotify deal, millions of dollars, and then moving to Texas and then trying to pull people with him to create a cluster, let's call it, there in Austin. And then Elon Musk has moved. So thinking about those important nodes of people, I remember when I was working in a town trying to attract people that didn't want to live there, I was wondering who those nodes are. And in that case, it used to be just women looking to settle down and have a kid. It's obviously that's very broad, but then when you start thinking about who exactly, and it's more a difficult question. Because I guess I'm thinking about in geography, the locational choice literature tends to talk about agglomeration. What they call them, agglomeration economies, that talk about how there is a benefit to being around others interested in what you're interested, from a business perspective, or sharing supply chains, knowledge spilling over. But then it's always a circular argument how that actually comes about. Nobody thinks about, okay, so when does a sand pile become a sand pile from a few grains? You have one person, so one Joe Rogan and Elon Musk. When does Austin become, and Texas become, the California of America? And then does California actually have the resilience of what's there already? Does it have strong enough quality of place to keep attracting others, or has it been, kind of using up the equity of its brand over the last years, and things were already kind of crap there, and we were just seeing from the outside. I've never been to California, but you could see hints that it wasn't what it probably was before. And I'm not just thinking about Hollywood, but also Silicon Valley, when You think about the innovators that used to be there, and now it's more about market speculation. So have they been hollowed out already? So interesting to think about it that way, but also maybe just some people want to prove themselves, whether they can do it on their own somewhere. So that's an interesting motivation to think about, just from kind of a news article. So then, going back to the literature, then, how can one say that moving away from California is, based on some biases? So you'd have perceptions about Texas being from the outside if you're Joe Rogan, and then, of course, you do, because you haven't got that much experience. But what information does it give us for that kind of a question? Very little, I'd argue. Doesn't mean that research program isn't very useful for other types of decisions, where there's already kind of a set of choices that are predefined, kind of like the domains in which that program has thrived, nudging people with policy. But big life decisions that have multiple complex, intertwined factors, I think it is much better studied if you ask people in detail about their experience and kind of eliciting information through multiple questions into them, what feels mundane to them, because they've either not thought about it or don't want to delve that deep because it can get a bit existential. And I'm finding this with my research, and I've got an interesting question, after I go through people's history of where they've lived and how they've changed and how they've actually made decisions in the detail, where I ask, would you think you've made rational decisions? Looking back, and it's the theme that's slightly coming out. It's all tentative, so I'm speculating here, but one thing that I'm thinking about quite a bit is rational seems to be what you'd be able to justify to others, be seen from the outside to be rational, or for someone from the outside looking in, they don't know exactly what's going on. You'd have to make that assumption that somebody is rational. And obviously within the everyday language, that's, being reasonable. I'm thinking about examples where that meant something different cross-culturally, because I had a participant from North America and one from Asia, where the North American participant saw the decisions they made as irrational when they were not following their own perceptions, but kind of foregoing those for the sake of listening to others. So that was seen as irrational. But on the other hand, the Asian participants saw following their own views rather than those of their parents, those of other, as being irrational. So there's rationality doesn't stack up cross-culturally, and that's been one of the key starting points for me, because it's one of the foundations of more standard economic approaches to decision making that talk about, let's assume people are rational at the individual level and then extrapolate from that to the aggregate. Or actually they just have aggregate data and they make up a story that seems rational at the individual level, without taking into account the fact that there is a scale transformation that might be happening there, where it's just not talking about the same thing. Just as, I'll go back to the methodological question, but just as measuring, the neural signals in neuroscience assesses things at one scale, and asking people about their lived experience at another, that's what's happening here. There's a scale transformation. You're looking at a different thing, and it doesn't mean it's not grounded in physical. In the case of lived experience. I'm not making any crazy claims, but it's just wherever you focus, it does seem to be better studied by different methods. And the assumptions of economists about, they're specialists in the macro that make that claim, and then they try to make a story of what the individual behavior is like in the first person perspective. It doesn't work that way exactly. I guess the last thing I want to talk about, and just to make this very practical, is that if you're working in any place management role, or interesting, I found an article in an encyclopedia on human geography that describes this territorial management. I actually like that because hints at animal territoriality and how it was entirely a practical endeavor that tries to balance conflicting drives, doesn't even pretend to be scientific. That was a very good description of what the job seems to be for people. So if what I've been talking about is, too theoretical, to make it very practical, I've already made the case for, using qualitative insight-led research, not just data from aggregates, from your social media and whatever, and all of these things. It's cheaper and less burdensome to just monitor aggregate stats of how people make decisions and then make a story retrospectively, and not retrospectively, but breaking it down to the first person and just seeing, oh, people have these stereotypes of our place and that's why they're not going to come. But double checking with qualitative insight, talking to people, deep listening, might actually help you learn where your own bias is about, from your own first person perspective, about what you guessed might be not exactly as you thought. So just, I'd recommend it, and it doesn't need to be huge. I've talked about how to do that in one of the other series. Yeah, that's not to knock monitoring analytics, absolutely not. But I think in the aggregate, the detail that might give you an insight for a good marketing campaign just gets lost. And I could never really pin down where marketing kind of lost its grounding in finding a qualitative insight for a good campaign to then being more analytics driven. I need to look through the history of these things. But that's obviously marketing more generally, not just the place marketing. I guess that just also makes me think about something I probably mentioned a few times already, but it's been a big realization of mine. So, because it's not that biases don't exist, but to me, when I got introduced into that literature and delved deep, it was so exciting because I felt like I was smarter than others. And then I realized that these are things, even if I'm aware of, there's nothing I can do about. So I realized they were just starting to map what our, human nature is like, whether you like it or not, and you can't undo it. But that became a miserable place to live from. And the points I've been making about how to live with that knowledge is that, yes, you're biased, and that doesn't mean being bad intention, all these things. If you want to remove from that lexicon, a bias in that literature is like a more just systematic deviation from the expected rational behavior. It just means that if you're like that, you have to always get another person to check in on you and just when you're reasoning, being reasonable is kind of reasoning with others. So I always make a case for social reasoning. But hey ho, that comes from the person that's actually recording a podcast alone rather than in conversation with other people these days. Because I've just selfishly wanted to explore where my ideas take me. But if anyone wants to comment, that's going to be very much appreciated. Or give me a shout if you want to do an interview.